Two great revolutions erupted from Germany in the mid-16th century. Martin Luther's Reformation challenged the Roman papacy as being nothing short of the Antichrist, igniting religious turmoil and military convulsions, the scars of which are still visible across Europe and the wider world today. And second only to Luther in terms of German language publications of that period was the maverick alchemist, physician, surgeon, and perhaps, let's be honest, probably sorcerer Paracelsus. His Reformation set the stage for modern pharmacology, modern toxicology, and it shattered millennia of medical and alchemical orthodoxy. And in his agenda-setting revolutionary works of the 1530s, the Paragonum, Against the Grain, and Paramirum, Greater Than Miracles, this guy's not in the least bit humble, he would inaugurate the Paracelsian revolution in alchemy and medicine. And with this episode, I want to bring to a close my multi-part series working through just those texts, though by no means are we finished with Paracelsus. But in this episode, I want to turn to what is perhaps the most hermetic of all those early tracts in the Paramirum, On the Matrix. No, not that matrix. This deeply theoretical, even speculative treatise deals with women's health, with the understanding of the feminine essence as the metaphysical matrix, literally the womb from which all creation itself emerges, the true microcosm of being itself. And as a pure microcosm of that macrocosmic creation, this feminine matrix, Paracelsus argues, requires a distinctly feminine form of medicine, thus inaugurating what we would now call women's health. Let's explore Paracelsus's profound hermetic development of women's health. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content just like this episode, like this series on Paracelsus, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon and some of the cool merch that we have available on the channel. Now, if you're new to the study of esotericism and you want a reliable study guide to get you oriented to this wild and wacky field, check out my study guide. And if you're interested in actual historical books on alchemy, the occult, and the mystical, like this cool book from the 1560s on ghosts of all things, check out Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all of those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's conclude this first series on the alchemical and medical revolution led by Paracelsus, here in the actual hermetic origins of the development of women's health on the Matrix. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The revolution led by Paracelsus and his followers is well known, but let's be honest, pretty poorly understood. Not that Paracelsus helps us a lot in that. Simply put, and to crib Voltaire, he's more celebrated than known. And I've been producing a series in which I pretty carefully work through all of his early so-called para-works, the Paragonum and the Paramirum, in which he really sets out his revolutionary agenda for the first time. And this episode concludes that first series on Paracelsus, and you may want to check out the links in the description and in the comments for the other episodes to kind of get you oriented about these documents. And to really appreciate this episode, it might be helpful just to catch up on Paracelsus more generally, and again, you can find more about Paracelsus all here on the channel. Just as a primer on Paracelsus, he broke decisively with both alchemical and especially medical traditions in the 1520s. He lectured in German, in the vernacular, and not in the scholastic Latin of the day. He urged experiment and lived experience rather than dogmatism of ancient textbooks. He suggested that folk traditions and the experience of working people, like miners, was just more reliable than highfalutin scholastic theory. He rejected the Galenic Avicennan humoral theory of disease, and he argued that nature alone could heal nature. He he argued that Hermetic sympathies were the key to the production of medicines, and that poison was in the dose, not in the essence of a thing. And right around this time of the year, at least the time of this filming, on the 23rd of June, 1527, he infamously burned the chief textbook of traditional European medicine, the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, in the market square of Basel, thus inaugurating his own Reformation. It's like Martin Luther hammering those theses to that church. The agenda of that revolution will be outlined in the two para works, the Paragranum, against the grain, and the Paramirum, greater than miracles. Now, I've covered almost all of those works with the exception of this episode, where I'm going to tackle the chapter on the Matrix from the Paramirum. Of course, this is just the first series on Paracelsus that I'll be doing. I still need to cover his cosmological, meteorological, theological, surgical, more of his magical books. Trust me, we are by no means done with Paracelsus with this episode. This is just the conclusion of the early Paracelsus. But let's cover perhaps today what is his most hermetic work. His work on women's health, interestingly enough, On the Matrix. At the core of On the Matrix is the deeply hermetic doctrine that there is an essential mirroring unity between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the upper and the lower worlds. And just as the divine created the upper worlds first, God created the heavens and then the earth, Adam and then Eve, then Paracelsus concludes that the matrix represents the conclusion of this creative circuit, with the feminine procreative power being the microcosmic instantiation of that divine macrocosmic power. As above, so below. If the divine generative power generates the cosmos, then that very creative power must contract to a microcosmic point at the conclusion of that very process of creation, and that very vector of creative power in the microcosm is simply what he terms the matrix. But no, I definitely don't mean the I know Kung Fu Matrix, not that Matrix, Keanu. Basically the opposite of that, in fact. Originally, matrix simply meant any pregnant creature, from mater in Latin, mother, something like in the process of mothering, matrix, in the process. Think Latin actor, actrix, dominator, dominatrix. But later it became metonymized as a sort of place of generation in an abstract sense, or even a mold that produces something. Even in mathematics, from James Joseph Sylvester, where arrays of numbers are the womb whereby determinants could be birthed, so to speak, in matrix studies. Thus, when we think of the matrix in Paracelsus's theory, it's functioning in at least three different registers all at once, and this is the stuff that makes Paracelsus just wonderful to study. It's the literal womb of a mother, it's the metaphysical point, the microcosmic reflection of that macrocosmic creative power, and it's the very process by which creation itself unfolds at this register of reality. For Paracelsus, it's only possible to have a proper medical understanding of a specifically woman's health as anchored in the womb matrix if one has an understanding of this hermetic and cosmological principle of the matrix as well. It's metaphysics as medicine. And here, Hermetic Metaphysics and cosmology are simply instantiated in the human body, and any physician, he tells us, that fails to grasp this metaphysical, medical, anatomical, physiological point will simply fail to treat their patient properly. And On the Matrix is one of the most theoretical and speculative of the so-called paratexts, though it isn't at all well edited, much like most of Paracelsus's works. It just reads like a rant at times. Rant, that's just kind of the way that Paracelsus writes. That's also just the kind of way Martin Luther writes. It's just Hermeticism and curse words. That's Paracelsus for you. But again, that's just sort of 16th century German long-form literature. I mean rants. I mean literature. It's like that uncle that types in all caps on Facebook. It's that. But as I mentioned, for Paracelsus, there are at least two principles of creation at work here. The active male principle of the limbus and the feminine matrix, which identifies the divine force of creation, and the primordial waters of the deep, those waters of the deep from the book of Genesis. Even in other places, Paracelsus likens the matrix to the causative four elements upon which efficient causation must act in order to create a specific substance, to translate it into Aristotelese. So this isn't exactly an active-passive dichotomy, the male being active and the female being passive, that we normally see, but two distinct but related forms of activity and creative power between the limbus and the matrix. But just as macrocosmic creation is housed, so to speak, in the sphere of the universe, so too is this microcosmic creative power housed in what he calls the smallest world, in the final being of creation. Again, think that second Genesis creation story with the feminine matrix. Creation, then, is bookended by two creative moments: the let there be light of the limbus, and the creative power of the womb as matrix to continue to procreate and thus populate the world. Thus, the matrix allows for the generation of everything that comes to be and grows in creation, and that force is exemplified in the procreative power of the organ of the womb as an expression of the invisible metaphysical matrix. Given that the mother, think the bearer of the matrix, is an enclosed world, this means that she is, in important sense, fundamentally different from the limbus-bearing male, and as such, women just sport a fundamentally different anatomy, pathology, symptomology, and thus a whole other curative regime other than that of men. And Paracelsus absolutely rails against what he refers to in traditional European medicine, which basically treated women as deficient men. You'll probably already know that traditional European and Islamic medicine held the homuncular theory of pregnancy and fetal development, such that a kind of sex-neutral, or really just sometimes a mini male person, a homunculus, was housed inside of sperm, which developed within the womb as a kind of passive incubator. Think easy bake oven in there. And given optimal or suboptimal conditions, if it were warm enough, then you would get a proper male body, and if it were too cold and wet, you would get a female body. And of course, if it were really messed up, you could give birth to monsters. Again, this is Aristotle stuff being taken up in Galen and Avicenna. But Paracelsus never fully rejected the homuncular theory, just to be clear. In fact, he held that you could even have an artificial womb and actually grow a creature by art. And this, of course, is the famous alchemical homunculus. Again, recall that women in his ideas have the metaphysical power of the matrix through the womb. But given that it is a metaphysical power, it could just as equally be housed in a device of art. Yeah, think the instruments of life stuff from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But what Paracelsus definitely seemed to have rejected in The Matrix is that women are simply deficient men. He doesn't accept that position of Aristotle, Avicenna, and Galen. Rather, they're their own world, or their own monarchy, as he uses the term, and therefore they must have their own distinctive rules which govern their anatomy, their pathology, their symptomology, and thus a whole other curative regime other than that of men. Women require their own medicine. Rather than the hermaphroditic medicine of Avicenna and Galen, Paracelsus contends that there should be a specific realm which treats specifically women's health in itself and on its own terms, and not simply derivative of men's health. And, unsurprisingly, Paracelsus urged physicians to learn from midwives and folk healers over and against academic doctors that treated women's health as either redundant or secondary to men's health. So in this way, women's health as an idea has its origins in the Hermetic ideas of Paracelsus. Now, before you get the impression that Paracelsus is some kind of 16th century feminist doctor or something like that, trust me, he had plenty of misogyny to dish out, and he isn't coming to these conclusions because he's pro-woman or pro the well-being of women in general outside of wanting to be a good physician to them. Paracelsus still holds that feminine weakness, for instance, ethical weakness, moral weakness, and spiritual weakness, is due to her being last in creation and doing that whole tempting Adam thing, hence why women are so prone to the vices, especially witchcraft. And Paracelsus isn't coming to these positions, like I said, because he's some kind of proto-feminist or something. he's coming to these positions mostly because, one, they're out of spite to the academic doctors who he just wants to continuously lambast as slavish morons, and two, because of his commitment to his Hermetic Metaphysics and how that grounds his medical theory over and against the Galenic Avicennan humoral theory. He likes this microcosmic, macrocosmic Hermetic stuff over and against the Aristotelianism of Galen and Avicenna. But despite this, Paracelsus does inaugurate yet another revolution: the introduction of learned women's health as a distinct field of medicine, and just the concept of specific domains of health regimes generally. And this is regardless, and perhaps even despite his opinion of women. Like most of us in history, we get things right very often for the wrong reasons, and Paracelsus is basically the poster boy for that. But regardless of why, Paracelsus spends a great deal of this essay detailing that the presence of the matrix in the womb should precisely inform how the physician inspects, diagnoses, and treats the various ailments that befall specifically women. What causes dropsy or jaundice in a man is likely to be different than what causes it in a woman. The diet of a woman is just going to be different than that of men. Medicine should be different between the limbus and the matrix. These are fundamentally different metaphysical entities which have different physical constitutions. And it's a wonder that this text is primarily theoretical rather than being programmatic. Paracelsus does virtually nothing in the way of giving practical advice. Rather, he urges the reader. He urges the physician reading it to enact his program and thus begin the process of experimentation that is ultimately going to build up the monarchy of women's health. And all of this, and for all of his pompous bluster, I mean, he was, after all, Aureolus, Theophrastus, Bombastus, von Hohenheim, Paracelsus. This essay is mostly laying out a research and programmatic agenda, again, through speculative Hermetic medical theory, and of course, he's using every opportunity he can to throw shade at the academic medical establishment, sort of medieval big pharma. Then he is actually giving concrete medical advice. This is him raising a battle flag, not telling anyone what to do. But there are, of course, many interesting medical insights that are probably fundamentally misguided, but super interesting. For instance, Paracelsus thinks of the matrix as a profoundly pure, even divine metaphysical force at work within the womb. But given that we are all sinners, especially women, of course, given the whole Eve business, the matrix needs to carve out a pure region within the housing of the womb itself. This purity of the matrix causes all of the sinful detritus in its housing, within the uterus, to be regularly shed and purged. And that shedding of the sinful detritus of the womb, that's menstruation for Paracelsus. It's again why he rejects that the menstruum could ever be used as anything curative. It's a sinful detritus, an excretion. But it does explain to him why it's so often used in witchcraft. I mean, again, I told you that homeboy ain't a feminist. Further, Paracelsus links the tidal actions of the moon with the tidal actions of the matrix, again building his system of macro and micro relations and sympathies or signatures inside of the body, which will ultimately come to inform his magical theories as well. But again, regardless of what you think about this theory, it reveals further just how dedicated Paracelsus is to Christian Hermeticism and how that is driving his speculations. Further, the physical matrix of the womb is also an important center of disease in the monarchy of women's medicine. Likening the matrix to a field out of which trees or crops grow, if the field itself is corrupt or otherwise diseased, then such a condition will spread to that from which it grows. Thus, the spiritual, ethical, and physical can cause corruption within the matrix and initiate a kind of negative feedback loop which can ultimately destroy the health and the life of a female patient. Even the power of the imagination comes to bear on the productive powers of the matrix, where the imagination, as both an organ of perception and causation, can also impress itself upon the metaphysical matrix. Thus, especially pregnant women should be protected from especially ghastly sights and protect themselves from projecting melancholic or morbid ideas which can negatively influence the development of the fetus within the matrix. And unsurprisingly, astrological influences should be reconsidered for their specific effect on the matrix, which as both a physical and metaphysical entity is especially vulnerable to specific astral conditions. Now, this brings us to one of the thorniest topics in the history of women's health, that of the uterine origins of mental illness, or the topic of hysteria. Now, this subject is admittedly vast, and I'll probably come back and cover it in another episode, but very briefly, Greek and Roman doctors took over from Egyptian medicine that mental illness, broadly construed, was either the result of demonic possession or the result of a wandering uterus, a hysteria in Greek, hence hysteria, and sometimes thought of as an excess of black bile. However, with Augustine and the rise of Christianity, the etiology of mental illness was largely shifted over to a metaphysical condition, that of original sin as it was manifested in women, especially because of the sin of Eve, an excess of sinful lust on the part of women, or just straightforward demonic possession. However, there were what are called nonconformists about the theory of mental illness, like the alchemist Arnold of Villanova, that sought to understand that mental illness was neither a wandering uterus, nor the purely hormoral theory, nor just demonic possession. And of course, by Paracelsus's day, this was a crucial medical and judicial question because of the overlap of the elaborated theory of witchcraft as demonic heresy, or simply women suffering from mental illness, which frankly could mean life or death for thousands of women. Paracelsus's position on mental illness as being reducible to merely suffocatio matricis, or suffocation of the matrix of the womb, and thus uniquely to be found in women, is interesting because he rejects it. Obviously rejecting the Galenic black bile etiology, but also wanting to show that mental illness, or hysteria, also occurs in men, Paracelsus rejected that the matrix would be the cause of such of illness at all. After all, why would the divinely creative power in the microcosm cause such a terrible condition? Rather, mental illness actually has multiple etiologies according to Paracelsus, from astral causation, depravity of the imagination upon the body, poor diet, ingestion of toxins, and Paracelsus even noticed that the condition can be inherited. It can be passed from parent to child. Thus, not only does Paracelsus reject that the hystera, the womb, is the cause of hysteria, but he naturalizes and democratizes it, as it were, the condition of mental illness to both men and women. And in this way, he prefigures Freud's work. And this medical analysis of the condition would actually be passed on to Cornelius Agrippa's student, Johann Wehr, who would argue in print that witches were nothing other than women suffering from melancholia, our precursor to what we now call mental illness. And as you can imagine, this earned him the ire, the absolute ire of many witch hunters, including King James I and the jurist Jean Bodin, because he's naturalizing the idea of witchcraft and basically conjuring it away. Thus, Paracelsus again inaugurates a profound shift, this time in psychiatry. Away from the hystera and black bile theory of mental illness, and nearly uniquely associated at that time with women, to a wider, more naturalistic theory of the condition, which also applies to men. Paracelsus ends On the Matrix announcing he's going to prepare a new volume detailing the three monarchies of medicine, those diseases which are particular to men and women respectively, and those which are shared hermaphroditically, and to do what he did best, lambast all the academic doctors as nothing short of doing the devil's work, appealing to scripture to out them as basically the grifters that they were, minted merely by secular universities and not, like the Paracelsian doctors, by the divine mandate of nature herself, the matrix of being. On the Matrix is classic Paracelsus. Vitriolic Christian Hermeticism meets maverick medical theories. And in this way, we get that Renaissance punk rocker Paracelsus that we all know and love. But his concept of the matrix, his naturalizing of mental illness, and his idea of the unique monarchy of women's health are all decisively important in the development of modern medicine and modern psychiatry. And while we won't always ever agree with him, The revolution led by Paracelsus has affected every single one of us, and we can at least better understand and appreciate that history because we're all living in it. As I mentioned in the past few episodes, the good news is that the Paragranum and the Paramirum are available for a mere $400 because of Brill. Thank you, academic publication, as extortion, but really thank you, Andrew Weeks, for producing these amazing volumes. But Paracelsus would be rolling his grave to know that academics are publishing his books for this much rather than democratizing them. So he's rolling in his grave. So you'll need to conjure them from the ether, you'll need to sell the seas or get them through ILL or something. But if you want a really wonderful, well-written account of Paracelsus's life and thought, Bruce Moran's brief and rather beautifully printed book on the topic is well worth getting. Philip Ball's The Devil's Doctor is a bit more of a popular treatment, but it's also a wonderful read if you want to get into the world of Paracelsus. But this episode is going to be the last in this first series wrapping the Paraworks, the Paragranum and the Paramirum, but fear not, I'll be coming back to cover his cosmological, meteorological, theological, magical, and even maybe some of his surgical writings in the future. So, trust me, much, much more on Aureolus, Theophrastus, Bombastus, von Hohenheim, aka Paracelsus. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane and history, philosophy, and religion.